Ever feel a chill run down your spine when you're near a quiet, dark body of water? There's something about the stillness of a lake, the way it hides its secrets beneath a placid surface. Today, we re-dive into a story that will make you think twice before casting a line into those murky depths. This is the tale of the Silent Lake. Our story begins with an old man named Arthur. Wrinkles crinkled around his eyes like a roadmap of his life. A life that began right here, by this very lake. As a boy, he'd spent countless summer afternoons with his grandfather, learning the patient art of angling. Now, returning after so many years, a wave of nostalgia washed over him. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the same smell he remembered from his childhood. The lake itself was just as he recalled, a vast, glassy expanse of dark water, ringed by ancient, whispering trees. Locals had always called it the Bottomless Lake. They'd spin yarns about how it was a direct gateway to the underworld, a place where things that went in never came out. Arthur chuckled at the memory of these old superstitions. They were just stories, after all. He found his old favorite spot, a small, moss-covered clearing that jutted out into the water. With practiced ease, he set up his gear. The rhythmic whir of the reel, the gentle plop of the lure hitting the waterette, was a symphony that soothed his soul. The hours melted away. The sun, a fiery orb in the afternoon sky, began its slow descent, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple. The lake's surface, once shimmering, grew darker, more mysterious. It was dusk, that magical, in-between time when the world seems to hold its breath. Just as he was thinking of packing up, he felt it, a sudden, violent tug on his line. This wasn't the nibble of a small perch. This was something huge. Adrenaline surged through him. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was the thrill he'd been chasing all his life. The rod bent into a deep, straining arc, the line singing as it spooled out. He braced his feet, digging his heels into the soft earth, and began the fight. He reeled, the muscles in his arms burning, then let the line run, then reeled again. It was a battle of willsmen against what? He imagined a monstrous catfish, a legendary pike, the kind of fish that becomes a local legend. The thought of the trophy, the story he'd tell, spurred him on. For what felt like an eternity, he fought the unseen beast in the deep. Slowly, painstakingly, he gained ground. The resistance lessened, and he could feel the weight being drawn closer, closer to the surface. His breath came in ragged gasps. He leaned over the water's edge, peering into the twilight gloom, his excitement reaching a fever pitch. He was about to land the catch of a lifetime. The water churned, bubbles broke the surface, and then something emerged from the black water. But it wasn't a fish. It wasn't scaled or gilled. It was pale, human-shaped. Arthur froze, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. A figure, drenched and dripping, rose silently from the lake. Its clothes were rotted and tattered, clinging to a gaunt frame. Long strands of dark green seaweed hung from its jaw like a grotesque beard. But the worst part, the part that made a scream catch in Arthur's throat, was its face. Where its eyes should have been, there were only two dark, empty, weeping. It was a face of pure, unending despair. He stumbled backward, dropping his rod with a clatter that seemed deafening in the sudden silence. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. The figure drifted closer to the shore, its movements unnaturally smooth, pulled by the fishing line still hooked to its tattered shirt. It stopped at the water's edge, its hollow gaze fixed on him. And then, a voice, a rasping whisper that sounded like waterlogged leaves, an ancient rot, slithered through the air. You were the one who threw me in. The words hit Arthur like a physical blow. He fell to the ground, scrambling backward through the dirt and leaves. No, he stammered, shaking his head violently. No, I've never hurt anyone in my life. It wasn't me. He had lived a quiet life, a good life. He was a fisherman, not a monster. The accusation was impossible, insane, but the figure just stood there, a silent, dripping monument to a forgotten crime. The empty sockets seemed to bore right through him. seeing not just his fear, but something deeper, something buried in the past. A sudden, splintered memory flashed in his mind. He was a small boy again, hiding behind a thick oak tree by this very lake. It was late at night, the moon hidden by clouds. He saw his grandfather, a big, strong man he had always idolized, arguing with another man near the water's edge. Their voices were low and angry. There was a struggle, a muffled shout, and then a heavy splash that echoed across the silent lake. His grandfather had turned, his face pale in the darkness, and saw little Arthur hiding. He had rushed over, clamped a hand over his mouth, and whispered fiercely, "You saw nothing. You will forget this. This lake keeps its secrets." The memory, suppressed for over 60 years, came flooding back with horrifying clarity. It wasn't Arthur who had committed the crime. It was his grandfather, the man he had loved and respected. He had witnessed a murder and had been sworn to a silence so deep he had forced himself to forget. Staring at the accusing figure, Arthur finally understood. The lake hadn't forgotten. The lake never forgot. The pool on his line hadn't been a fish. It was the past, reaching out from its watery grave, demanding to be remembered. The figure took a slow, shambling step out of the water and onto the land. Its whisper came again, closer this time, filled with the cold of the bottomless depths. "But the debt is yours to pay." Arthur's final scream was swallowed by the vast, silent darkness surrounding the lake. The water settled back into its placid stillness, reflecting the first stars of the night sky, forever guarding the secrets it held within. Sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't the ones lurking in the dark, but the ones buried in our own history, waiting for the right moment to surface. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more chills. See you next time. You ever find something on the ground, something old and forgotten, and feel an instant connection? A little treasure just for you. That's what 17-year-old Leo thought when he found the hook. He was skipping stones across the Silver Creek, just like he'd done 1,000 times, when he saw it. Tucked between a mossy rock and the muddy bank, a large iron hook rusted a deep, angry orange. It was heavy, strangely shaped, not like any modern fishing hook he'd ever seen. It felt ancient. He pocketed it, a little piece of river history, his new lucky charm. That was his first mistake. That night, it started, a faint, persistent dripping sound. Drip, drip. 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 Leo checked all the faucets. He lay back in bed, trying to ignore it, but the sound seemed to be coming from right inside his room. Then came the smell, a thick, cloying odor of damp earth, and something else, something foul, like rotten fish left in the sun too long. He searched his room, checked under his bed, in his closet, but found nothing. The smell was everywhere and nowhere at once. He finally drifted off to a restless sleep, dreaming of dark, murky water and things with too many teeth. He woke up with a sharp sting on his hand. A thin, red line snaked across his palm, so fine it looked like a paper cut. But it felt deeper, more deliberate. He glanced at his bedside table. The hook sat there, looking darker and more menacing than it had in the sunlight. He dismissed the scratch. Maybe he'd done it in his sleep. But the next morning, there was another one, this time on his other hand. And the night after, a third appeared on his forearm. They were all identical, thin, deep, and perfectly straight, as if drawn by a razor-sharp fishing wire. The dripping sound grew louder each night. The smell of decay more potent. It was like a piece of the river had followed him home. Leo wasn't a superstitious guy, but this was getting weird. His lucky charm was feeling a lot more like a curse. The scratches now crisscrossed his arms. Sleep was almost impossible. The dripping sounded like a torrent, and the fishy stench clung to his clothes, his hair. His friends started noticing, wrinkling their noses when he got close. "Dude, did you go swimming in a sewer?" one asked. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't explain the shadows he saw darting in the corners of his vision, or the feeling of being watched by cold, wet eyes. The hook had to go. It was the only thing that made sense. After a week of this personal torment, Leo decided he'd had enough. He grabbed the hook, its rusted surface feeling strangely cold and clammy against his skin, and pedaled his bike furiously back to Silver Creek. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the water. He stood at the edge of the bank, at the exact spot he'd found it. With all his might, he hurled the hook back into the river. It hit the surface with a loud plunk and vanished into the murky depths. A wave of relief washed over him. It was over. He turned to leave, a smile finally returning to his face. That's when he heard it. A voice. It wasn't human. It was a gurgling, watery whisper that seemed to bubble up from the riverbed itself, echoing in the twilight air. It was a sound that didn't travel through his ears, but vibrated deep inside his bones. The voice said 2 words, a chilling, impossible command. "Find me." Leo froze, his blood turning to ice. The voice came again, louder this time, a chorus of watery echoes. "Find the rest of me." He stared at the river, which now seemed black and bottomless. The hook wasn't just a hook, it was a piece of something that had been dragged down here a long, long time ago. And now, the river wanted it all back. Panic seized him. He scrambled back onto his bike and fled, not looking back. But he couldn't escape the voice. It was in his head now, a constant, gurgling whisper. "Find me." That night was the worst yet. The dripping wasn't just a sound. His bedroom floor was genuinely wet. Puddles of dark, foul-smelling water were pooling on the floorboards, seeping from no discernible source. And the scratches, they were no longer thin lines. Deep gouges appeared on his legs, his chest shaped like grasping, 3-fingered hands. He screamed, but no sound came out. In the reflection of his bedroom window, he saw it. A towering, hunched silhouette standing behind him, its form wavering like a heat haze. It was made of water and river sludge and tangled weeds, and from the place where its hand should be, a single, rusted iron hook was missing. Leo knew he had 2 choices: go mad in his own bedroom, or go back to the river. The entity, the spirit, whatever it was tied to him through that hook. Returning it wasn't enough. He had to fulfill its request. The next day, armed with a shovel and a stomach full of dread, he returned to Silver Creek. He started digging around the spot where he'd found the hook. The ground was soft and muddy. An hour in, his shovel hit something hard. Not a rock. It was metal. He dug faster, his heart pounding. He unearthed a heavy, rusted iron chain linked to a thick manacle. It looked ancient, like something from a prison ship. The chain led deeper into the riverbank. He pulled, but it was anchored to something heavy, something buried deep in the mud. He followed the chain, digging a trench towards the water. The gurgling whisper in his head grew stronger, more urgent. Closer. Find me. As he dug, he found other things. A tarnished silver button from an old coat, a single, waterlogged leather boot, scraps of what might have been a sailor's uniform. He was unearthing a grave, a story buried by the river. The chain led directly into the water. To go in. Wading into the cold creek, he followed the chain with his hands, pulling himself deeper. It snagged on something massive. He reached down into the black silty water, his hands closing around the cold, unforgiving bars of a cage. An old, iron gibbet cage, the kind used for public displays centuries ago, and inside it was a skeleton. It was tangled in the chains, the bones stained dark by the river. As his fingers brushed against the rib cage, the gurgling voice exploded in his mind. Not a whisper anymore, but a roar of agony and rage. Images flooded his vision. A sailor, wrongly accused of mutiny. A captain's cruel justice, being locked in this cage. A hook brutally pierced through his hand, and being thrown into the river to be forgotten. The hook wasn't a lucky charm. It was an instrument of torture. The last piece of this man's identity before he was erased by the water. The spirit wasn't malevolent. It was just lost, desperate to be whole again, to be found. Leo worked frantically, pulling the broken cage and the skeleton within it onto the river bank. He gathered every piece, the bones, the chains, the scraps of clothing, and placed the rusted hook back into the skeletal hand where it belonged. He laid the man to rest, creating a proper burial mound above the floodplain, marking it with stones. As it finissait, a profound silence fell over the creek. The air cleared. The oppressive feeling lifted. The gurgling voice in his head was gone, replaced by a single, faint whisper that sounded almost like, "Thank you." Leo never went back to Silver Creek. The scratches on his body faded into pale white scars, a permanent reminder of the hook that wasn't his, and the history the river demanded he unearth. Sometimes, on quiet nights, he thinks he can still smell the river, but it's a clean, fresh scent now. The river is at peace, and so is the sailor it held for so long. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more tales from the shadows. See you next time. In the sleepy coastal village of Porthmore, the sea wasn't just a livelihood, it was a living entity, breathing with the tides and whispering secrets to those who dared to listen. For generations, the fishermen of Porthmore had cast the same nets, their threads woven not just with twine, but with time itself. These weren't ordinary nets. They were heirlooms, passed down from father to son, their knots holding stories older than the village's salt-stained cottages. Every morning, as the sun's first rays painted the gray water with strokes of gold, a strange phenomenon would occur. As the fishermen hauled their catch, a chorus of whispers would rise from the nets, mingling with the cries of gulls and the crash of waves. It was a sound as familiar as the salty air faint. Ethereal murmurs, like the sigh of a sleeping giant. The villagers had long since grown accustomed to it. They called them the whispering nets. "It's just the sea," the old-timers would say, their faces weathered like driftwood, the wind playing tricks on old twine. They learned to ignore the whispers, to treat them as part of the ocean's morning song. The nets always brought a bountiful catch, and for a village that lived and died by the sea, that was all that mattered. But for a young fisherman named Elian, the whispers were more than just the wind. He was different from the others. While they saw the sea as a resource, Elian saw it as a mystery. He had an insatiable curiosity that often got him into trouble, and a keen ear that heard things others missed. He noticed the whispers weren't random. They had a cadence, a rhythm, almost like fragmented conversations. He'd strained to hear, trying to catch a single, clear word, but they always remained just beyond his grasp, like trying to hold smoke in his hands. The other fishermen would laugh at him. "Chasing sea ghosts again, Elian?" They'd tease, clapping him on the back. "You'll find more fish than phantoms in those nets." But Elian couldn't shake the feeling that the nets held something more than just fish and seaweed. He felt a cold presence clinging to them, a weight that had nothing to do with their physical mass. One evening, as a storm brewed on the horizon, darkening the sky to a bruised purple, Elian made a decision. The village was battening down the hatches, securing boats and barring shutters against the coming gale. The pier was deserted, the fleet of small fishing boats bobbing nervously in the churning harbor. Everyone else had gone home to the warmth of their hearths. But Elian stayed. He told his family he was doing one last check on his boat, but his true purpose was much different. He was going to listen. He wanted to hear the nets without the distraction of the morning's work, without the chatter of the other men. He wanted to hear their secrets in the dead of night. He made his way to the long, low shed where the nets were hung to dry. The wind howled outside, rattling the wooden structure, but inside, an unnatural stillness prevailed. The air was thick and cold, heavy with the smell of salt and something else, something ancient and decayed. Rows of the great nets hung from the rafters like massive, dormant spiderwebs, their dark forms barely visible in the gloom. He lit a single lantern, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows that made the nets seem to sway and breathe. At first, there was only silence, broken by the storm's fury. Elian sat on an overturned crate, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He waited. An hour passed, then another. The storm raged, and doubt began to creep into his mind. Maybe the others were right. Maybe it was just the wind, his imagination, a folktale spun from sea mist and superstition. He was about to give up, to head home and admit defeat. when he heard it, a single, faint whisper, cutting through the noise of the storm. It was clearer than he had ever heard it before. Help! Elian froze, the blood turning to ice in his veins. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. A human voice, filled with despair. He held his breath, straining to hear more. Another whisper joined the first, then another, and another, until the air was filled with them. They were no longer the gentle murmurs of the morning. These were desperate, pleading sounds, the voices of the lost and the forgotten. They swirled around him, a vortex of spectral sound. He could almost make out words, fragments of terror-filled pleas. It pulls. Can't breathe. The dark. Driven by a mix of terror and a desperate need to understand. Elian stepped closer to the nearest net. The whispers seemed to be coming directly from its tangled threads. As he reached out a trembling hand, the sounds intensified dramatically. The whispers weren't just around him anymore. They were inside his head, a cacophony of pain and fear. And then, the whispers changed. They twisted, their pleading tones hardening into something malevolent. The pleas for help morphed into shrieks of pure, undiluted horror. Screams. The shed was filled with the sound of 100 screaming voices, echoing from a place beyond life, beyond the sea. Elian stumbled back, clapping his hands over his ears. But it did no good. The sound was inside him, clawing at his mind. His lantern light flickered wildly, and in the strobing darkness, he saw the impossible. The nets were moving, not swaying in a draft, but writhing, twisting on their own accord. The thick, tarred ropes began to slither down from the rafters like monstrous, black pythons. They coiled and uncoiled on the floor, the knots tightening and loosening like flexing muscles. Panic seized him. He turned to run, to flee the nightmare shed, but he was too late. A single, rope-like tendril shot out from the nearest net, impossibly fast. It wrapped around his ankle, its grip like a band of iron. He cried out, kicking frantically, but it was useless. Another tendril snaked around his other leg, and he crashed to the floor. The lantern fell from his grasp, shattering on the stone and plunging the shed into near-total darkness, leaving only the dim, gray light filtering through the grimy windows. He was being dragged. The nets pulled him across the floor, his fingernails scraping uselessly against the stone. He screamed for help, but his voice was swallowed by the unholy chorus of the nets in the roaring storm. More and more tendrils wrapped around him, covering his legs, his torso, his arms. The pressure was immense, squeezing the air from his lungs. It felt like being constricted by a colossal serpent, the rough twine scraping his skin raw. The whispers had become a single, deafening roar in his mind, the agony of countless souls. In the final moments, as the net tightened around his throat, he saw it. Within the twisting threads, he saw fleeting images' faces, contorted in terror. The faces of men and women he'd never known, their eyes wide with the same horror that now claimed him. They were the voices. They were the net. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose over a placid, clean-washed world. The villagers emerged, assessing the minor damage from the gale. They noticed Elian was missing. His family, frantic with worry, led the search. They went to the pier, to his boat, and finally, to the net shed. When they pushed open the heavy wooden door, sunlight streamed into the dusty space. Everything looked normal. The nets hung silently from the rafters, still and heavy, dripping the last of the night's moisture onto the floor. The shed was empty. There was no sign of Elian, no sign of a struggle. All they found was the shattered remains of his lantern on the floor. They searched the coastline for days, but Elian was never seen again. The sea, they concluded, had claimed another soul during the storm. Life in Porthmore returned to normal. The fishermen went out each morning, casting the same ancient nets into the grey waters. But something had changed. As they hauled their catch, the familiar whispers rose from the nets to greet the dawn. They were a little louder now, a little clearer, and to those with a keen enough ear, to those who dared to listen closely, they might have noticed that among the chorus of spectral murmurs, a new voice had joined the eternal. Whispering lament, it was a voice filled with despair and a chillingly familiar curiosity. The whispering nets were one voice stronger, and they were always hungry for more. The call of the open water. There's nothing quite like it. Right. The gentle lapping of waves against the hull. The first rays of dawn painting the sky. The thrill of the first bite. For seasoned fisherman Elias Thorne, this was his sanctuary. But one moonless night, the familiar embrace of the lake turned into something cold, something sinister. Elias had been chasing a legendary walleye, a phantom of the deep rumored to patrol the furthest, most secluded parts of Blackwood Lake. He'd been out for hours, guided only by the dim glow of his fish finder and the silver sliver of a crescent moon. Then, without warning, a fog rolled in. Not your usual morning mist. This was a thick, suffocating blanket that swallowed the moonlight whole. One minute he could see the shoreline. The next, he was adrift in an endless sea of gray. His compass spun wildly. His GPS was on the fritz, and a chilling sense of disorientation began to set in. He cut the engine, letting the boat drift, hoping the fog would lift as quickly as it had arrived. But it only grew denser, colder. It was in this disorienting silence that he first saw a faint, ethereal glow piercing through the oppressive gloom. He squinted, trying to make it out. It wasn't the familiar beacon of the lighthouse or the warm lights of a distant cabin. This light pulsed, a sickly green, beckoning him closer. Driven by a mix of desperation and curiosity, Elias steered his small fishing boat towards the glow. As he neared what he now saw was the shore, the light resolved into a dilapidated sign. Neon letters, flickering and humming, spelled out a strange invitation. Bait and tackle after dark. Elias had fished this lake his entire life. He knew every cove, every landing, every bait shop within a 50-mile radius. This place, it shouldn't have been there. The shop itself was a ramshackle building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own secrets. It leaned precariously toward the water, its wood weathered and gray, almost blending into the fog. Hesitantly, he tied his boat to a rotting pier and stepped onto the creaking boards. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and vaguely unsettling. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, a small bell chimed with a dissonant clang. The interior was even stranger than the outside. It was lit by the same eerie green glow, emanating from glowing jars that lined the shelves from floor to ceiling. This wasn't your typical bait shop. There were no neatly packaged lures or colorful plastic worms. Instead, the shelves held a grotesque collection of what could only be described as nightmare fuel for fishermen. There were jars filled with writhing leech clusters, their bodies shimmering under the green light. Others contained glassy-eyed minnows, perfectly preserved but with a look of sheer terror frozen on their tiny faces. And then there were the worms. Huge, thick night crawlers that didn't just wriggle. They pulsed rhythmically, like tiny, exposed veins, their movements hypnotic and deeply disturbing. Elias felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and leave, to get back in his boat and take his chances with the fog. But the desire to catch that legendary walleye, the pride of an old fisherman, was a powerful lure. "Can I help you?" A voice rasped from the shadows, making Elias jump. An old man emerged from behind the counter. He was as weathered as the shop itself, his face a roadmap of deep-set wrinkles, and his eyes, barely visible under a heavy brow, seemed to hold the darkness of the lake's deepest trenches. "I need some bait," Elias stammered, feeling foolish. "Something for walleye, something special." The shopkeeper let out a dry, rattling chuckle that sounded like stones grinding together. He didn't move towards the shelves. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out a small, unmarked wooden box. He slid it across the dusty surface towards Elias. "This," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is what you're looking for. The finest bait in this world, or any other." Elias cautiously opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried moss, was a single lure. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was carved from a pale, bone-like material and shaped like a small, terrified fish. But the most unsettling part was its eyes. They weren't painted on or made of glass. They were tiny shimmering black orbs that seemed to track his every move. They looked alive. "What is this?" Elias asked, his voice barely a whisper. The shopkeeper smiled, a grim, toothless expression. A whisper from the deep, he replied. But I must warn you, you only use my bait if you're ready to meet what bites. The things that swim in these waters at night, they hunger for more than just a simple meal. The warning hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Any sane person would have thanked the man and backed out of the door. But Elias wasn't just any person. He was a fisherman, possessed by an obsession. He saw the lure not as a warning, but as a promise. The promise of the catch of a lifetime. He scoffed, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. I've been fishing these waters since I was a boy. I can handle anything this lake throws at me. He threw a few crumpled bills on the counter, grabbed the box, and turned to leave, not wanting to spend another second in that unsettling place. As he reached the door, the old man's voice followed him. A final, chilling note. We shall see, it rasped. The lake always collects its due. Back in his boat, the fog was beginning to thin slightly. Elias could just make out the dark silhouettes of the trees on the far bank. The strange green glow of the shop was already gone, as if it had been swallowed by the night the moment he left. He shook his head, trying to clear the lingering sense of dread. It was just an old eccentric, he told himself. A hermit with a flair for the dramatic. He motored back out to his favorite spot, a deep channel where the current was strong. With trembling hands, he tied the bone lure to his line. As it hit the water, it didn't make the usual plop. Instead, it slipped beneath the surface with barely a ripple, almost as if the water welcomed it home. The lure glowed faintly in the murky depths, its black eyes seeming to stare up at him from below. He didn't have to wait long. Minutes turned into an hour, then another. The eerie silence of the lake returned. Just as he was starting to think the old man had sold him a useless trinket, it happened. The rod was nearly ripped from his hands. It bent into a violent arc, the line screaming from the reel at a speed he'd never witnessed. This was it. The fight he'd been dreaming of. This was no walleye. The power on the other end of the line was immense, primal. It wasn't fighting like a fish. It didn't dart left or right at hoofs pulled. A steady, inexorable pull, straight down into the blackest depths of the lake. Elias's muscles burned. His knuckles were white as he fought to gain even an inch of line. But it was useless. The thing on the other end was toying with him, drawing him further from the center of the boat, closer to the water's edge. For what felt like an eternity, he held on, a grim battle of wills between man and monster. He was exhausted, his body screaming in protest, but the fisherman's pride refused to let go. He had to see it. He had to know what he had hooked. He leaned over the side of the boat, peering into the inky blackness, trying to catch a glimpse of his prize. And that's when he felt it, a sudden, terrifying slack in the line. His heart sank. It was gone. But before the disappointment could even register, the water directly beneath him began to churn. A shape, large and dark, rose from the depths. It wasn't a fish. It was pale, slick, and horrifically long. Two eyes, identical to the shimmering black orbs on the lure, broke the surface and stared directly into his. In that moment, Elias Thorne understood the shopkeeper's warning. He hadn't just caught something. Something had caught him. The line, which he thought had gone slack, suddenly whipped out of the water and wrapped around his wrist like a living tentacle. Before he could even cry out, a tremendous force pulled him over the side. The cold of the lake was a shock, but it was nothing compared to the paralyzing terror as he was dragged down into the crushing, silent dark. He never even had a chance to scream. The next morning, the sun rose on a perfectly calm Blackwood lake. The fog was gone. The water was like glass. Elias Thorne's small fishing boat was found drifting peacefully in the middle of the channel. His gear was all there, his thermos of coffee still warm. But of Elias, there was no sign. The only thing out of place was a set of wet, bare footprints on the floor of the boat. They didn't lead to the edge. They led from the edge, across the deck, and simply stopped. As if whatever had made them had stepped out of the water, stood for a moment in the empty boat, and then vanished into the morning air, leaving nothing behind but a lingering smell of damp earth and the deep, cold darkness of the lake. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more tales from the deep. Stay safe out there.